The woman's wrists were bound tightly by cold metal cuffs. Facing public humiliation, Officer Mark Johnson sneered, loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear, "People like you don't belong in first class." His badge glinted under the bright airport lights as he tightened the handcuffs one notch too far, a petty act of cruelty meant to assert dominance and inflict discomfort without leaving any evidence. Jessica Brown, a Harvard-educated attorney, philanthropist, and humanitarian, met Officer Johnson's gaze without flinching. All around her, fellow passengers paused to stare, many raising their phones to record the unfolding drama. The officer's actions were not just a display of authority, they exposed a deeper prejudice that Jessica would soon challenge. "Officer," Jessica said, her voice steady and clear, "you're making a mistake. You'll regret this soon enough." Johnson laughed, dismissing her with derision, unaware of who she truly was. He had no idea that the woman he was treating like a criminal was more than just a black woman. He would soon learn that his decision to insult her would lead to his own downfall. Before diving deeper into the story, if you believe in treating everyone with fairness and respect, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Share where you're watching from in the comments, because what unfolds next in this story will leave you speechless. Around them, travelers whispered and exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others instinctively pulled out their phones to document the encounter. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted, a collective tension rising as more people recognized the injustice occurring before their eyes. Before she found herself handcuffed in the bustling airport terminal, Jessica Brown was simply preparing for her humanitarian journey to Sudan. At 32 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth and the challenges she had overcome. On that crisp autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her elegant yet modest home, illuminating the space as she carefully packed medical supplies into her carry-on bag. Inside the bag were antibiotics meant to treat infections in children who might otherwise face dire consequences. She had vaccines that could protect entire communities and specialized equipment desperately needed by smaller medical outposts in Sudan. Jessica was on a mission to help those less fortunate. As she finished packing, her phone buzzed with a familiar ringtone, specially assigned for her husband, David. The screen lit up with a photo of them taken during a trip to Rwanda the previous year. After 10 years of marriage, he still looked at her with the same admiration he had when they were college students, full of dreams and ambition. "Hey, Jessica." David's voice resonated warmly on the other end. He had started as a baggage handler at an airport, working long shifts while studying at night, and had since built a successful airline from the ground up. "Are you all set for your flight?" he asked, the wariness from his early morning meetings evident in his tone. "Almost ready," Jessica replied, smiling at the sound of his voice. "I've got the levels of delivery will help hundreds of children at the camp." The director mentioned they've been without basic antibiotics for almost a month. "I wish I could join you this time," David said with genuine regret. "But I have a board meeting that can't be rescheduled, and we need to finalize the expansion to Paris. Someone has to keep the airline running." Jessica laughed, feeling no resentment in her heart. "Besides, you'll be there for the school opening next month. That's the more joyful occasion anyway. I've arranged for Daniel to meet you before your connecting flight," David added, referring to their airport station manager. "He'll ensure that the medical supplies transfer smoothly." "You really don't have to do that," Jessica said, appreciating but declining his thoughtfulness. "I can manage a connection like everyone else." "I know you can," David replied, "but I don't want you to experience any delays. Daniel insisted when he heard you were coming through." Their conversation flowed easily, a testament to the strong bond they shared. Jessica enjoyed traveling without special treatment. However, word had spread among David's employees, and they treated her with care due to her status as the wife of the airline's CEO. Although she rarely flew first class, she had opted for at this time, a rare concession for the long international flight ahead and the important work awaiting her arrival. As she left her home, the driver David had arranged, a trusted friend rather than a chauffeur, arrived promptly. Jessica double-checked her passport and vaccination records, tucking her ID into her purse while taking a deep breath to center herself for the journey ahead. Little did she know that her greatest challenge would not be in the refugee camp in Sudan, but right here in an American airport, where one officer would see her not as a humanitarian or a successful woman, but simply as a black woman he deemed unworthy of first class. Around her, the atmosphere buzzed with energy as travelers hurried to their gates, some casting curious glances at Jessica, sensing the tension that was brewing. As Jessica Brown stepped into the expansive international terminal, the subtle shift in atmosphere became palpable. At the Skyline Airlines check-in counter, she presented her passport and her confirmation for a first-class ticket to Paris, connecting to Khartoum. The agent's gaze flicked nervously between her and the computer screen, doubt flickering across his face. First class to Paris, he questioned, emphasizing the words as if they were a rare anomaly. Are you sure about that booking? Jessica had faced such skepticism before. The unspoken assumption that a well-dressed black woman standing before them could not possibly have legitimately purchased a premium ticket. Yes, I'm sure, she replied calmly, sliding her confirmation slip across the counter. Say 2A, the agent typed reluctantly, his expression skill to comb. And how will you be paying for any additional baggage fees or in-flight purchases? I won't have any extra baggage. Jessica responded, everything is within my first-class allowance. Just then, a white businessman in a wrinkled suit approached the adjacent counter, and the same agent's colleague greeted him with a warm smile. Good morning, sir. Flying to London today. Let's get you checked in quickly so you can enjoy the lounge. No questions about his ticket class. No insinuation that he didn't belong. After finally receiving her boarding pass, Jessica made her way toward security. That's when she first noticed him, Officer Mark Johnson, a man in his mid-40s, who carried himself with the swagger of someone who relished the authority his uniform provided. He stood at the entrance to the security lanes, directing passengers with an air of superiority. White family with small children, express lane, right this way, he called out. Group of business travelers, priority screening, to your left. His voice rose in impatience as he directed an elderly couple looking confused. Regular screening that way, Jessica observed as Officer Johnson ushered every white passenger with a priority boarding pass through the expedited lane. When a Hispanic man in a business suit presented his first-class boarding pass, Johnson scrutinized it carefully before reluctantly waving him through. With her first-class ticket and priority access, Jessica approached the expedited screening lane. Johnson immediately stepped into her path. Regular screening is that way, Mom, he said firmly, pointing toward the longer line, where the wait seemed to stretch interminably. I have priority access, Jessica replied politely, showing him her boarding pass. First class. Without even glancing at her document, Johnson retorted, we need to verify that. Please step aside. Verify what, exactly? Jessica asked, her voice composed but firm. My boarding pass clearly shows priority access. Ma'am, I decide who needs verification. That's my job. Step aside, or you'll be delaying other passengers. As a small crowd began to gather, Jessica stood her ground, feeling the weight of their curious stares. Officer, I've noticed you've allowed every other passenger with priority access through without verification. I'm simply asking for equal treatment. Johnson's face hardened in response. Are you accusing me of something? I'm making an observation, Jessica replied calmly. A supervisor, a white woman in her 50s wearing a badge, approached. Is there a problem here? She asked, her eyes darting between Jessica and Johnson. I'd like to report what seems to be discriminatory treatment, Jessica stated. I've been denied access to the priority lane despite having a first-class ticket, while others with identical documentation have been allowed through without question. The supervisor barely glanced at Jessica's boarding pass. Officer Johnson is following security protocols. Some passengers or some verification based on security algorithms. And what algorithms would those be? Jessica inquired, raising an eyebrow slightly. The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. I'm not at liberty to discuss security procedures, but I can assure you it's random selection. Random. Jessica replied, skepticism evident in her tone. I've been observing for 10 minutes, and the pattern doesn't appear random at all. Ma'am, questioning security procedures can itself be flagged as suspicious behavior, the supervisor said, her tone carrying a slight warning. Johnson seemed pleased by the supervisor's tacit support. You've been selected for additional screening. Step this way. As Jessica was led to a separate area, she noticed other travelers watching, some with sympathy, others averting their eyes. The universal response of those who witness injustice, but prefer not to get involved. The additional screening area was set apart, visible to onlookers, making the humiliation all the more public. Around them, whispers spread through the crowd, some passengers nodding in agreement with Jessica's plight, while others exchanged concerned glances, unsure of how to react to the unfolding situation. As Jessica was taken to the additional screening area, Officer Johnson's demeanor became increasingly condescending. He snapped on blue latex gloves with exaggerated slowness, clearly relishing the display of authority. Open your carry-on, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for defiance. As Jessica complied, he began removing items one by one, inspecting each with an air of theatrical suspicion. When he reached the medical supplies, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. That's a lot of medication, he commented, feigning interest. What are these for? They're donations for a refugee camp in Sudan, Jessica explained, trying to maintain her composure. I have all the proper documentation and import permissions. Johnson barely glanced at the papers she offered. Seems like a lot of trouble to go through. Most people just enjoy their vacations without all this baggage. It's not a vacation, Jessica corrected him firmly. It's humanitarian work. Johnson smirked as he continued his invasive search. Humanitarian work in a first-class seat. That seems wasteful. His words were designed to sting, implying that Jessica's presence in first class was somehow fraudulent or inappropriate. My travel arrangements are relevant to security screening, Jessica replied, her patience wearing thin, but her composure intact. Johnson, sensing he was getting under her skin, moved closer, invading her personal space. You know what I've noticed in my 15 years on the job? He said, his voice low but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. First class is usually for people who can afford it. Not people like you. The words landed like a physical blow. The raw prejudice behind his actions was now fully exposed. A collective intake of breath from those observing confirmed that the line had been crossed. Even in 2025, such blatant discrimination was shocking when witnessed in broad daylight. Jessica's expression remained calm, but inside, she felt a surge of frustration. I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately, she stated, her voice steady. My supervisor is busy, Johnson replied dismissively. Then I'd like to speak to their supervisor, Jessica insisted. Your comments are inappropriate and discriminatory. Johnson's face flushed with anger at being challenged directly. You're becoming disruptive, ma'am. Interfering with security procedures is a federal offense. The threat hung in the air. Clear and intimidating: comply and accept the humiliation or face escalating consequences. Jessica looked directly at Johnson, carefully weighing her response. I understand security procedures, Officer Johnson. I also understand my rights as a traveler. Your personal comments about my appearance and assumptions about my economic status are not part of legitimate security protocols. You don't belong here, he shouted, his voice rising. You people always think you know your rights. Jessica repeated the phrase in disbelief, the weight of his words heavy in the air. Reynolds realized his mistake too late. The mask of professionalism had slipped completely. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. You heard me, he shouted. Entitled people who don't know their place, always ready to play the victim card. When it's about attitude. Your attitude is the problem here. As Johnson's voice echoed through the terminal, other passengers shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other in disbelief. Others continued filming the interaction, documenting the abuse of power unfolding before them. Jessica spotted the terminal operations supervisor, Karen, standing at the periphery, clearly aware of the escalating situation, but hesitant to intervene. Miss Matthews, I need to speak with you about Officer Johnson's conduct, she called out, her voice firm. Matthews pretended not to hear, turning away to speak with another employee, while Johnson seemed emboldened by her lack of action. He leaned closer to Jessica, a cruel smile creeping onto his face. You know what happens to difficult passengers, he said, dripping with condescension. They miss their flights. Security concerns can take hours to resolve, sometimes days. Sometimes they end up on no-fly lists. The threat was unmistakable. It was no longer about security. It was punishment for questioning authority, for refusing to accept humiliation quietly. Are you threatening to prevent me from boarding my flight because I questioned your discriminatory treatment? Jessica asked, maintaining her calm demeanor. Johnson smirked, clearly enjoying the power he wielded. I'm explaining the consequences of continued non-compliance and disruptive behavior. With calculated precision, he began repacking Jessing items together, deliberately disorganizing the carefully arranged medical supplies. Oops, he said with false concern as he accidentally knocked over a container of medications. Security can be messy sometimes. It was the most petty form of powers, the ability to create inconvenience without consequence, to punish through 1,000 small humiliations. Jessica's resolve began to fade as she watched her carefully prepared supplies being mishandled. Those weren't just her belongings. They represented life, saving treatments for vulnerable children. I need those medications to remain organized and intact, she said firmly. They're properly labeled for distribution at the medical camp. Should have thought about that before you decided to be difficult. Johnson replied with a smirk. Maybe next time you'll show proper respect for the process. As the public humiliation reached its peak, Johnson's voice grew louder, ensuring that everyone nearby could witness Jessica's treatment. His actions were a clear display of dominance over an uppity black woman who dared to speak out. Several passengers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, while the tension in the air thickened. Then, in a moment of fateful miscalculation, Johnson reached for his handcuffs. In fact, he said, your increasingly agitated behavior is concerning me. You're exhibiting signs of potential threat. I'm standing perfectly still and speaking calmly, Jessica pointed out. How exactly am I threatening you? Johnson's expression darkened. That tone, those questions, the way you're standing in my professional assessment, You're becoming aggressive. He was fabricating a narrative of threat where none existed, laying the groundwork for escalation from harassment to arrest. Are you seriously suggesting that asking questions about discriminatory treatment constitutes aggression? Jessica asked, disbelief evident in her voice. There you go again, questioning my authority, Johnson said, unclipping his handcuffs. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. At that moment, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The tension in the terminal escalated, with onlookers now fully aware of the injustice taking place. Jessica's heart raced, but she stood her ground, determined to fight against the discrimination she was facing. Jessica had made a decision. As Officer Johnson ordered her to turn around, she slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Before you place me under arrest on fabricated charges, I'd like to make one phone call, she said, her voice calm yet resolute. This isn't a TV show, Johnson scoffed. You don't get a phone call until you're at the station. Actually, Jessica replied, since I haven't been formally arrested yet, I retain my full rights as a citizen. One call, then you can proceed what you deem appropriate. Johnson hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her confidence. Still, his ego wouldn't allow him to back down, especially with a crowd gathering around them. Go ahead, he said dismissively. Call your lawyer. It won't change the fact that you're about to miss your flight and spend the night in a cell. With deliberate calmness, Jessica dialed a number she knew by heart. When the call connected, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying enough for those nearby to hear. David, it's me. I need you at Terminal B, International Department Security Checkpoint 7. Officer Mark Johnson is trying to arrest me on fabricated charges. No, I'm fine. I've remained completely calm. Yes, there are witnesses and recordings. I understand. I'll see you soon. Johnson rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed by what he assumed was just a bluff. Her husband rushing to the rescue. How sweet. He couldn't have known that David was not just any concerned spouse. He was David Parker, founder and CEO of Skyline Airlines, the very company whose terminal they were standing in. As Jessica hung up, she noticed the crowd around them shifting. Travelers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with her plight, while others continued to record the incident on their phones. The tension in the air thickened as people began to realize the gravity of the situation. Officer Johnson, still unaware of the magnitude of his mistake, tightened his grip on the cuffs, ready to drag Jessica away. But as he did, a commotion erupted at the entrance of the terminal. Airport security personnel began to clear a path through the crowd, and Jessica could see David rushing toward her, his expression a mix of concern and determination. Jessica, he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The atmosphere shifted once more, and the passengers who had been silent began to murmur amongst themselves, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding drama. Lieutenant Davis, Johnson's direct supervisor, approached rapidly, his face a mask of professional concern that concealed an unmistakable alarm. Johnson, he barked, his voice commanding. Stand down immediately. The sudden authority in Lieutenant Davis's tone caught everyone off guard, including Officer Johnson. I'm handling a disruptive passenger who... Remove those handcuffs now, Davis interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. That's a direct order. The tension reached a boiling point as the crowd held its breath, watching the confrontation unfold. Jessica felt a surge of hope as she saw David approaching, determination etched on his face. But sir, I've already initiated the arrest process, Johnson protested, but there was no confidence left in his voice. Johnson, this is serious, Lieutenant Davis insisted. Release her now. You don't understand the severity of what you're doing. As the tension hung in the air, David arrived at Jessica's side, his presence commanding and reassuring. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes locking onto Officer Johnson. Johnson looked between Jessica and David, confusion and frustration evident on his face. "I'm arresting her for disorderly conduct and obstruction of security procedures," he declared, as if trying to assert his authority. The collective gasp from onlookers echoed throughout the terminal, disbelief etched on their faces. Jessica felt a rush of adrenaline, her heart pounding as she stood tall, refusing to back down. Lieutenant Davis turned to Jessica, his demeanor shifting to one of respect. "Miss Brown, I sincerely apologize for this incident. Your husband is arriving now, and we will resolve this immediately." As Johnson stood there, stunned and defensive, the reality of his actions began to settle in. He had made a grave error, and the weight of it pressed heavily on him. Jessica's heart raced, not just from the adrenaline of the moment, but from the realization that she had fought back against injustice, and that help was finally here. The crowd began to murmur again, the tension slowly dissipating as people sensed that justice might prevail. As David stepped forward, ready to defend his wife and confront Officer Johnson, the atmosphere shifted from one of hostility to one of anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see the outcome of this confrontation, aware that it would have repercussions far beyond this single incident. Officer Johnson's world was about to collapse around him. As David Parker approached, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. The airport director himself appeared, nervously adjusting his tie while creating a path through the crowded terminal. Something significant was happening, and Johnson's confident demeanor began to crumble, replaced by the first tendrils of genuine fear. "Lieutenant," Johnson asked, his voice lowered, "who exactly is her husband?" Lieutenant Davis looked at Johnson with a mixture of pity and anger. "David Parker," he said simply, as if the name alone should explain everything. Johnson shook his head, still not comprehending. "Am I supposed to know who that is?" The lieutenant gestured toward the windows overlooking the airfield, where dozens of aircraft bore the distinctive Skyline Airlines logo. Beyond them stood the corporate headquarters building, the name Parker visible even at this distance. "David Parker," the lieutenant repeated slowly, "founder and CEO of Skyline Airlines, the company that employs half the people in this terminal, the man who sits on the airport authority board, and the person who just got off the phone with the governor about a certain officer's conduct." The blood drained from Johnson's face as reality crashed down upon him. He had handcuffed, humiliated, and threatened the wife of one of the most powerful men in the state. A man whose company controlled a significant portion of the airport's revenue, and whose philanthropic work had earned him the respect of everyone from baggage handlers to political leaders. "I didn't know," Johnson stammered, looking desperately at Lieutenant Davis. "How was I supposed to know who she was?" "That's exactly the point, Johnson," Davis replied, his voice hard. "You're not supposed to treat anyone this way, regardless of who they are or who they're married to. The fact that you only care now that you know her connections is precisely the problem." As David reached them, his expression was not one of rage, but of controlled determination. He was a man accustomed to solving problems, to handling crises with a clear head. His first concern was for Jessica. "Are you all right?" he asked, gently examining the marks on her wrists where the handcuffs had been too tight. "I'm fine," Jessica assured him, her dignity intact despite Johnson's efforts to strip it away. David nodded, then turned to face Officer Johnson. The contrast between the two men was striking. David in his tailored suit, radiating quiet authority, Johnson in his uniform that suddenly seemed to hang loosely on his frame, his earlier swagger evaporated. "Officer Johnson," David began, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I understand you felt it necessary to handcuff my wife because she questioned being denied access to priority screening despite having a first-class ticket. Is that correct?" Johnson's mouth opened and closed, no words emerging. And you told her, and I quote, "First class is usually for people who can afford it, not people like you. Is that also correct?" The terminal had fallen silent, everyone within earshot transfixed by the unfolding scene. Johnson looked desperately toward his supervisor, finding no support there. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding," Johnson finally managed. "Security protocols sometimes require additional—" "Let me stop you there," David interrupted, his tone measured but firm. "I'm very familiar with airport security protocols. In fact, I sit on 3 different aviation security committees. What happened here wasn't protocol, it was prejudice, plain and simple." Johnson's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and defensive anger. "Sir, with all due respect, you weren't here for the entire interaction. Your wife was becoming increasingly agitated and, fortunately," David cut in, "dozens of passengers recorded the entire incident." He gestured to the crowd around them, many still holding up their phones. "I've already received several videos, and I suspect more are being uploaded to social media as we speak. The footage shows no signs of agitation on my wife's part, only a calm insistence on being treated with the same respect afforded to other passengers." A young woman stepped forward from the crowd, her phone still recording. "I have the whole thing, sir," she offered. From the moment she approached the security line, she never raised her voice once. Others murmured in agreement, some calling out their own observations of Johnson's behavior. The public sentiment was clear, and Johnson found himself not only facing the wrath of a powerful executive, but also the judgment of dozens of witnesses who had seen his prejudice on full display. The airport director, who had been hovering nervously at the edge of the confrontation, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, on behalf of the airport authority, I want to express our deepest apologies for this incident. I assure you that we take these matters extremely seriously and will be conducting a full investigation." David nodded acknowledgement, but kept his focus on Officer Johnson. "An investigation is certainly warranted, but let's be clear about what happened here. My wife was discriminated against of the color of her skin. She was denied access to services she had paid for, subjected to humiliation, had her property mishandled, and was ultimately handcuffed, all because she calmly insisted on being treated equally." Johnson, desperate to salvage something from the situation, attempted one last defense. "Sir, I treat all passengers the same. This isn't about race." "Then explain," Jessica interjected calmly, "why every white passenger with a priority boarding pass was directed to expedited screening without question, while I was singled out for verification. Explain why you commented specifically on whether people like me belong in first class. What exactly did you mean by people like me, Officer Johnson?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable because the answer was obvious to everyone present. Johnson had no response, his silence damning. David turned to Lieutenant Davis. "I expect a formal investigation into this incident, including a review of all complaints filed against Officer Johnson. I suspect this isn't the first time he's engaged in this kind of behavior. Just the first time he's been caught so publicly." Davis nodded gravely. "We'll begin immediately, sir. Officer Johnson will be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation." As Johnson was led away by his supervisor, the crowd around them began to disperse, many lingering to express their support to Jessica. Some approached to share their own stories of discrimination at security checkpoints, grateful that someone had finally stood up to the system. In the aftermath, as Jessica and David sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, she reflected on what had just occurred. This happens every day to people who don't have the privilege of a husband who owns an airline. She said softly, "Most of them have no recourse." David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Then perhaps it's time we used our position to do something about it. Not just for you, but for everyone who faces this kind of treatment." Jessica smiled, squeezing his hand. That's exactly what I was thinking. The incident that had begun as one officer's attempt to humiliate a woman he deemed unworthy of respect was about to transform into something much larger. A catalyst for change in a system that had protected men like Officer Johnson for far too long. In the days following the incident, the story of Jessica Brown's confrontation with Officer Johnson exploded across social media and news outlets. The videos taken by witnesses had gone viral, amassing millions of views and igniting a national conversation about racial profiling in airport security. What had begun as one woman's stand against discrimination had become a movement. 1 week after the incident, David and Jessica sat in a conference room at Skyline Airlines headquarters, surrounded by their legal team, civil rights attorneys, and representatives from various passenger advocacy groups. The atmosphere was serious but charged with purpose. The internal investigation confirmed what we already knew, said Rachel Chen, Skyline's chief legal officer, sliding a folder across the table. Officer Johnson has a documented history of complaints regarding discriminatory treatment. 17 formal complaints in the past 3 years alone, all filed by passengers of color, all dismissed without proper investigation. David nodded, unsurprised. And the airport authorities' response? They're in damage control mode. Rachel replied, they've placed Johnson on unpaid leave pending the outcome of a more thorough investigation, but they're resistant to acknowledging the systemic nature of the problem. Jessica leaned forward, her expression determined. That's not good enough. This isn't about one officer or one incident. The videos show clearly that Johnson's supervisor, Karen Matthews, was complicit. She witnessed the discrimination and not only failed to intervene, but actively supported his actions. You're absolutely right, agreed Michael Torres, a respected civil rights attorney they had brought onto the team. The issue is structural. Johnson felt empowered to act that way because the system has historically protected officers who engage in profiling. The fact that 17 prior complaints were dismissed speaks volumes. David turned to Jessica, his expression softening. What do you want to do? This is your experience, your fight. I'm here to support whatever direction you choose. Jessica was quiet for a moment, considering. When she spoke, her voice was clear and resolute. We have a unique opportunity here. Most people who experience this kind of discrimination don't have the resources or platform to challenge the system effectively. We do. She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. I want to use this incident to create real, lasting change. Over the next hour, they outlined a comprehensive strategy. First, they would file a formal civil rights lawsuit against both Officer Johnson and the airport authority, seeking not just damages but systemic reforms in security screening procedures. Second, they would leverage Skyline Airlines' position in the industry to advocate for new training protocols and accountability measures for security personnel across all airports where they operated. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they would establish the Brown Justice Initiative, a foundation dedicated to providing legal support to travelers who experience discrimination at security checkpoints, but lacked the resources to fight back. We need to ensure that what happened to me becomes a catalyst for change, not just another incident that fades from public memory. Jessica explained, every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race, appearance, or perceived social status. As the meeting concluded, David's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at it, then looked up with a grim smile. The airport authority just issued a statement. They've terminated Officer Johnson's employment, effective immediately. A murmur went around the table. A small victory, but everyone present knew it was just the beginning. 3 months later, Jessica stood at a podium in the same international terminal where she had been handcuffed. Behind her stood David, airport officials, civil rights leaders, and Most significantly, dozens of individuals who had come forward with their own stories of discrimination at security checkpoints. Today marks a new chapter in airport security. Jessica announced to the assembled press and onlookers, "The settlement we've reached with the airport authority includes mandatory anti-bias training for all security personnel, transparent reporting of all discrimination complaints, and an independent review board to investigate allegations of profiling." She paused, looking out at the faces before her, some skeptical, some hopeful, all attentive. But this isn't just about new policies on paper. It's about changing a culture that has too often valued authority over dignity, security theater over actual safety. True security doesn't come from humiliating innocent travelers or enforcing arbitrary standards based on appearance or race. It comes from treating every person with respect while implementing evidence-based screening protocols. As Jessica continued her speech, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Jamie Ordaz, the young customer service and declining, who had attempted to intervene during her confrontation with Officer Johnson. Jamie had since been promoted to lead a new passenger advocacy office within the terminal, a direct result of Jessica and David had pushed for. "What happened to me was not unique," Jessica concluded. "What is unique is that we have the opportunity to ensure it doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. The Brown Justice Initiative will provide legal support to travelers who experience discrimination, and Skyline Airlines has committed to implementing these same reforms at every airport where we operate." The applause was thunderous, but Jessica knew that the real work was just beginning. Changing policies was one thing, changing hearts and minds was another. But as she looked out at the diverse faces of those who had gathered to support this initiative, she felt genuine hope. Later that evening, as Jessica and David prepared for her rescheduled humanitarian trip to Sudan, she reflected on how a moment of injustice had transformed into an opportunity for meaningful change. "You know," David said, "helping her path been at the center of the confrontation. What Johnson never understood was that your worth had nothing to do with your ability to afford a first-class ticket or who you were married to. It was always about who you are, your compassion, your courage, your unwillingness to accept injustice, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet." Jessica smiled, touched by his words. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is stand our ground, even when, especially when, others try to tell us we don't belong. As they finished packing, Jessica's phone chimed with notifications, more messages from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination, thanking her for taking a stand. The incident that had begun with one officer's prejudice had sparked a movement that would impact countless lives. The next morning, as Jessica boarded her flight to Sudan, first class, unapologetically, she noticed something different. The security checkpoint had been transformed. Gone was the arbitrary division between those deemed worthy of expedited screening and those who were not. In its place was a system based on objective criteria, applied equally to all passengers, regardless of appearance or background. It wasn't perfect, imperfect humans ever could be, but it was progress. And as Jessica settled into her seat, she knew that sometimes progress began with one person refusing to accept discrimination, one moment of standing firm in the face of injustice, one voice saying clearly, "I belong here too." Around her, fellow passengers nodded in recognition, some offering quiet words of support or gratitude. The atmosphere in the cabin was different, more respectful, more aware, as the plane prepared for takeoff. Jessica looked out the window at the terminal building, thinking about all the travelers who would pass through it in the coming years. Thanks to what had happened that day, many of them would have a different experience. One marked by dignity rather than discrimination, by respect rather than suspicion. It wasn't just about one woman in first class anymore. It was about changing a system that had failed too many for too long. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Jessica Brown smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was not just to overcome it, but to transform it into an opportunity for change that would benefit many more than just yourself.